Good evening, and welcome to Somnolent Sagas. Tonight we embark on a lengthy and, we trust, deeply unexciting journey into the intricate world of medieval English wool trade regulations. Our focus will be the period spanning from approximately the year 1200 to the year 1400, a time of gradual development and often repetitive administrative adjustments in how England managed its most valuable export. Settle in, allow your mind to soften, and let the dry details of historical bureaucracy gently guide you towards rest. There will be no daring merchants nor dramatic confrontations, merely the slow, steady evolution of rules, officials, and the mundane mechanics of control. Before we delve into the gradual imposition of regulations, it is necessary, though we shall not dwell on it with any undue excitement, to briefly acknowledge the status of English wool in the broader European context of the 13th century. English wool, particularly from certain regions renowned for the quality of their fleeces, the Cotswolds, for instance, or the pastures of Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, was highly prized across the continent. The length of its staple, the fineness of its fiber, these were qualities sought after by the burgeoning cloth industries of Flanders, Brabant, and Italy. Towns like Ghent, Ypres, and Florence relied heavily on consistent supplies of English wool to produce the fine textiles that were, in turn, a cornerstone of their own economic prosperity. The sheep of England, grazing upon the downlands and in the river valleys, were thus, in a very quiet and unassuming way, connected to the looms and markets of distant lands. The scale of this production, even in the early 13th century, was considerable. While precise figures are, as with much medieval data, subject to debate and reconstruction, it is generally accepted that tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of sacks of wool were produced annually. Each sack, a standardized weight, represented the fleece of many sheep. This vast agricultural output formed the backbone of England's export economy. However, in these earlier decades of the 13th century, the mechanisms governing its trade were largely localized and lacked significant, overarching central regulation from the Crown. Trade patterns were often direct, with English merchants, or indeed the great monastic houses, which were themselves significant wool producers, dealing with traveling merchants from the continent. Fairs and local markets served as points of collection and initial sale. The ports along the eastern and southern coasts, Boston, Hull, Sandwich, Southampton, London, were natural conduits for this trade, their quaysides witnessing the loading of wool onto ships bound for Calais, Bruges, or other continental destinations. Yet, the hand of the royal administration in these transactions was, at this stage, relatively light and primarily concerned with the general maintenance of peace and the king's rights to certain traditional, often ad hoc levies, rather than a systematic and detailed regulation of the wool trade itself. The concept of a customs system, as we might later understand it, was rudimentary. The Crown did possess ancient rights to presage on certain goods, which was the right to take a portion of imported wine, for instance, or to levy tolls at specific points. But a dedicated nationwide system for taxing wool exports with a defined bureaucracy and standardized procedures was yet to be fully formed. The administrative machinery was simply not in place, nor perhaps was the immediate royal impetus to create such a system in the early years of the 1300s. The focus was often more on direct land taxes, feudal dues, and the profits of justice. The idea of wool as a consistent and massively exploitable source of royal revenue, requiring its own dedicated administrative framework, was still in its nascent stages, a concept slowly dawning rather than a fully realized policy. Therefore, the merchant of the early 13th century, while subject to local tolls and the general laws of the land, operated with a degree of freedom from centralized royal control over the specifics of his wool transactions that would gradually diminish in the decades and centuries to come, as we shall tediously explore. The great monastic orders, such as the Cistercians, played a not insignificant role in this early wool production. Their extensive landholdings, often in remote upland areas well suited for sheep grazing, made them major suppliers to the market. These orders, with their organized structures and international connections, were often capable of managing their wool sales with considerable acumen, sometimes dealing directly with major Italian or Flemish merchant houses. Their record-keeping, primarily for their own internal administration, provides some glimpses into the scale and nature of the trade, but these were private arrangements, not yet subject to the kind of detailed scrutiny and regulatory interference that would later characterize royal policy. The sale of their wool clip was a major source of their income, funding their building projects and their charitable activities, all quietly proceeding without the need for extensive royal permits or export licenses beyond the general requirements of the time. The transportation of wool from the inland areas of production to the coastal ports was itself a logistical undertaking, though one we shall not imbue with any artificial sense of adventure. Pack horses forming long, slow-moving trains, or carts lumbering along rudimentary roads, would carry the wool sacks to the designated collection points. The state of these roads, often poorly maintained, would have added to the time and cost of transport. There were no royal inspectors specifically overseeing the quality of wool at the point of inland sale, nor any standardized royal way-beams in every market town. Such matters were left to the agreements between buyer and seller, to local customs, and to the reputation of the wool producers. The system, if one could call it that, was diffuse, organic, and largely self-regulating, or rather regulated by the immediate interests of the parties involved in each transaction. This lack of central oversight, this reliance on local custom and individual bargains, is the backdrop against which the later, more intrusive and far more detailed regulatory structures were gradually and often painstakingly erected by a crown increasingly aware of the fiscal potential lying dormant within those fluffy fleeces. We will see how, step by laborious step, this landscape of relative freedom was altered. As the 13th century progressed, the English crown, often embroiled in costly military ventures on the continent or facing internal baronial unrest, began to cast an increasingly covetous eye upon the wealth generated by the wool trade. The reigns of King John and his son Henry III, for instance, were marked by persistent financial pressures. While direct land taxes, such as the carucage or the 15th, remained important, the idea of tapping into the flow of trade, particularly the export of this highly valuable commodity, began to take more concrete, if still somewhat tentative, shape. This period, roughly from the turn of the century to around the year 1275, saw the initial, often experimental attempts by the royal administration to impose levies and exert a modicum of control over wool exports. These early interventions were not yet a fully coherent system of customs, but rather an extension and adaptation of existing royal prerogatives. The right of prisage, traditionally applied to wine imports, where the king's butler could take 1 or 2 tons of wine from each ship, offered a conceptual precedent. However, applying such a system to a bulk export like wool presented different challenges. More common were ad hoc levies, sometimes termed maltotes, or evil tolls by disgruntled merchants, which were essentially arbitrary taxes imposed on goods, including wool, often justified by the king's pressing financial needs, particularly for warfare. These were unpopular and often inconsistent, varying in amount and duration, and lacking a clear legal framework beyond the king's asserted right to tax in times of necessity. Such arbitrary impositions naturally created uncertainty and resentment among the merchant community, both English and foreign. Alongside these occasional levies, the concept of a more regular custom on wool began to emerge, albeit slowly. Early pipe rolls and other financial records of the exchequer start to show entries referring to payments received for licenses to export wool or sums collected at ports from wool merchants. These were often negotiated amounts or fixed sums per sack, but the machinery for their systematic collection across all ports and for all shipments was still developing. The primary agents for collection at this stage were often the local sheriffs, the king's chief administrative officers in the counties. Sheriffs were already responsible for collecting various royal dues, and the task of overseeing wool levies was simply added to their manifold responsibilities. However, the sheriffs were not trade specialists, nor were their bailiwicks always aligned with the primary flows of trade. Their effectiveness in this new role was variable, and opportunities for evasion or for local officials to take their own unauthorized cuts were, one might surmise, plentiful. The challenges in assessment and collection were considerable. Determining the true quantity of wool being exported, ensuring that all merchants paid the required dues, and then transmitting these funds securely to the Royal Exchequer in Westminster, all presented significant administrative hurdles. There was a lack of specialized personnel stationed permanently at the ports with the sole duty of customs collection. Record-keeping was often rudimentary, relying on the diligence of individual officials rather than a standardized system of ledgers and receipts. This inconsistency inevitably led to shortfalls in revenue and to disputes between merchants and royal agents. The very definition of what constituted a sack of wool for taxation purposes could vary, and the quality of wool, which greatly affected its price, was not yet systematically factored into these early, rather blunt fiscal instruments. Nevertheless, the Crown persisted. Ordinances were occasionally issued, such as those during periods of political tension with France or Flanders, which might temporarily prohibit wool exports to certain destinations or require special licenses. For example, during disputes, the king might order the arrest of Flemish merchants and the seizure of their goods, including wool, which would then be sold for the king's profit, a rather direct, if disruptive, form of revenue generation. These actions, while not customs duties in the strict sense, did represent royal intervention in the trade and an assertion of the crown's authority over it. The new aid of 1237, levied by Henry III, included taxes on various forms of movable property and merchandise, and wool would certainly have fallen under such a general levy, though it was not yet singled out with the same specificity that would later occur. The period also saw the increasing involvement of Italian merchant societies such as the Riccardi of Lucca or the Frescobaldi of Florence. These well-organized international trading and banking houses often acted as lenders to the English crown. In return for loans, they were sometimes granted privileges, including the right to collect certain royal revenues, or preferential treatment in the payment of duties on the wool they themselves exported. This outsourcing of revenue collection to foreign merchants, while providing the king with much-needed upfront cash, further complicated the administrative landscape and sometimes led to resentment from English merchants who felt disadvantaged. The Italians, with their sophisticated accounting methods and international networks, were often more efficient collectors than the king's own officials, but their primary loyalty was to their own profit, not necessarily to the long-term development of a fair and consistent English customs system. Thus, the 75 years or so after 1200 were characterized by a gradual, often reactive, and somewhat haphazard extension of royal fiscal interest into the wool trade. It was a period of experimentation, of learning by trial and error, with the crown slowly realizing both the potential revenue and the administrative complexities involved. The systems were still far from comprehensive or uniform, and the concept of a permanent professional customs service dedicated to wool was yet to materialize. But the foundations were being laid, the precedents set, for the more systematic and ultimately more burdensome regulations that would follow under Edward I and his successors, as the English state sought ever more effective ways to harness the wealth of its most prized agricultural product. The merchant of this era navigated a shifting landscape of royal demands, local exactions, and the inherent risks of medieval commerce. Consider the actual process of collection. A merchant arriving at a port, say Boston in Lincolnshire, with a consignment of wool destined for Flanders, would need to declare his goods. To whom he declared and what proof was required remained somewhat ill-defined. If a royal official, perhaps a deputy of the sheriff or a specially appointed bailiff, was present, a negotiation might ensue regarding the amount of duty to be paid. This might be based on a locally proclaimed rate per sack, or it might be a lump sum for the right to export. The official would then be responsible for accounting for this sum to the exchequer, a process that could be lengthy and subject to various administrative frictions. The use of tallies, notched sticks split in two, one half for the payer, one for the exchequer, was a common method of receipting, a tangible but somewhat cumbersome form of record-keeping in an age before widespread literacy and carbon copies. The very weighing of the wool could be a point of contention. Whose weights were to be used? Were they accurate? The tron, or official weigh beam, was not yet a universal fixture in all ports, controlled by a dedicated royal official. Local lords or municipalities might have their own weigh beams and charge a fee for their use, adding another layer of cost and potential dispute for the merchant. The lack of standardization was a persistent issue, creating opportunities for inconsistency and for accusations of unfair dealing on all sides. The system, such as it was, relied heavily on the perceived authority of the king's officers and the reluctant compliance of merchants who knew that obstruction could lead to costly delays or even seizure of their valuable cargo. It was a period where royal power was projected intermittently and with varying degrees of effectiveness across the diverse ports of the kingdom. Each port might have slightly different local customs and practices, all overlaid by these increasingly frequent, but not yet fully systematized, royal demands for a share of the wool profits. This ad hoc nature was a defining characteristic of these early attempts at regulation. The reign of Edward I, beginning in 1272, marks a significant turning point in the administration and taxation of the English wool trade. Driven by the immense costs of his military campaigns in Wales, Scotland, and Gascony, Edward sought more regular, predictable, and substantial revenues. This era witnessed the formal establishment of what became known as the ancient custom, or great and ancient custom, on wool, wool fells, sheepskins with the wool still on, and hides, and the tentative beginnings of the staple system, designed to channel trade through specific ports for easier control and taxation. In 1275, a crucial statute was enacted, often seen as the cornerstone of the medieval English customs system. This legislation formalized the king's right to levy a specific export duty on each sack of wool and on every 300 wool fells, equated to 1 sack of wool for duty purposes, and on each last of hides, a measure for leather. The rate for wool was set at half a mark per sack, which was 6 shillings and 8 pence. This was a significant sum, representing a notable percentage of the wool's value. Unlike the earlier, often arbitrary maltotes, the ancient custom was established by parliamentary consent, or at least with the acquiescence of the magnates and merchants in Parliament, lending it a greater degree of legitimacy and permanence. This was not a temporary war tax, but a regular and enduring source of royal income. The implementation of this ancient custom required a more organized administrative apparatus. The Statute of 1275 provided for the appointment of collectors of customs in the principal ports. These were to be good and loyal men, often drawn from the local merchant class or gentry, who were responsible for assessing the wool, collecting the duties, and accounting for them to the exchequer. They were aided by controllers, whose function was to keep a separate set of records, a counter roll, to verify the collector's accounts, a system of checks and balances designed to reduce fraud and error. Furthermore, the office of the tronager became more formalized. The tronager was responsible for the official weighing of the wool at the king's tron, or weigh-beam, ensuring that the correct quantity was declared for duty. The use of the coquette seal also became standard. Once the duty was paid, the merchant's goods were sealed with the coquette, A mark of official clearance and a certificate or coquette letter was issued, which served as proof of payment and permission to export. This system, while a significant improvement, was not without its challenges. The collectors and controllers, though supposedly good and loyal, were not always immune to corruption or inefficiency. The vast coastline of England made smuggling a persistent problem. Merchants, ever keen to maximize their profits, would seek ways to evade the duties, perhaps by declaring fewer sacks than they were actually exporting, or by attempting to ship wool from smaller, less well-monitored creeks and havens rather than the designated customs ports. The penalties for such evasion could be severe, including forfeiture of the goods, but the temptation remained. The records of the Exchequer are replete with cases of alleged fraud and disputes over customs payments. Alongside the establishment of the ancient custom, Edward I and his immediate successors also experimented with the concept of the staple. The staple was a designated town or towns, often on the continent, like Calais, Bruges, or Antwerp at different times, through which all, or a significant portion, of English wool exports were required to pass. The idea behind the staple was manifold. It concentrated the trade in one place, making it easier for royal officials to monitor, tax, and control. It also allowed the king to use the wool trade as a tool of diplomacy by granting the privilege of hosting the staple to friendly powers, or by moving it to exert pressure on others. Furthermore, it was believed that by channeling all wool through a single point, English merchants could act as a more effective cartel, maintaining higher prices for their wool against foreign buyers. The establishment and location of the staple were, however, subjects of much political debate and frequent change throughout the 14th century. English merchants often resented being forced to trade through a specific foreign town, which might be dominated by a particular group of middlemen or subject to local tolls and regulations that ate into their profits. Some argued for home staples located in English port towns before the wool was exported. This would give English merchants more control over the initial stages of the sale. The Crown, on the other hand, often preferred continental staples, as it made the collection of duties, sometimes collected at the staple itself, more straightforward and provided a useful diplomatic lever. The actual location of the staple therefore shifted numerous times, from various towns in Flanders and Brabant to Calais after its capture by the English, and sometimes, though less frequently, to English towns. This constant shifting created further uncertainty for merchants, who had to adapt their trading routes and business relationships accordingly. During this period, from roughly 1275 to the mid-14th century, the rate of the ancient custom remained relatively stable at half a mark per sack. However, this was often supplemented by additional levies, particularly during times of war. Edward I, and later Edward III, during the early phases of the 100 Years' War, frequently imposed extra taxes on wool, sometimes called subsidies or maltotes, often with, and sometimes without, parliamentary consent. These subsidies could be substantial, at times adding several more shillings or even pounds per sack to the basic ancient custom. For instance, in the 1290s, during his wars against France and Scotland, Edward I imposed significantly higher rates, leading to considerable outcry from merchants. These prerogative levies, taken by the king's will, were a constant source of tension. Parliament often tried to assert its control over such taxation, granting subsidies for fixed periods and specific purposes, but the Crown frequently sought to bypass these restrictions when financial need was pressing. The administration of these duties also grew more complex. Specialized exchequer officials, such as the Clerk of the King's Customs, emerged to oversee the national system. Instructions were sent out to the local collectors, detailing procedures for assessment, collection, and accounting. The audit of customs accounts in the exchequer became a more regular and rigorous process. Despite these improvements, the system was still reliant on the integrity and diligence of numerous individuals scattered across the kingdom, and the challenges of communication and enforcement over distance remained. The records from this period, such as the particular accounts of individual customs collectors, provide a fascinating, if dry, insight into the day-to-day workings of the system, the names of merchants, the ships they used, the quantities of wool they exported, the duties paid, and sometimes notes on disputes or attempts at evasion. Each entry represented a small part of a vast, ongoing administrative effort to channel the wealth of English wool into the royal coffers. It was a slow, bureaucratic grind, essential to the financing of the medieval English state, but devoid of glamour. The very process at the quayside became more formalized. A merchant wishing to export wool would bring his sacks to the designated customs house or quay. The wool would be inspected, perhaps cursorily for quality, but certainly for quantity. The tronager, with his official beam and weights, would weigh each sack. The collectors, using this information, would calculate the duty owed based on the ancient custom and any current subsidies. The merchant would make payment or provide surety for future payment. A clerk would record the transaction in the customs roll, and the controller would make a parallel entry in his counter roll. The coquet seal would be applied, and the coquet letter issued. Only then could the wool be legally loaded onto a ship for export. Each step was a small bureaucratic act, repeated countless times in ports around England. Imagine the queues, the paperwork, parchment work, rather, the quiet discussions over weights and payments, all proceeding at the deliberate pace of medieval administration. The impact of these regulations on the wool producers themselves, the farmers and landowners, is harder to gauge directly from the customs records, which primarily concern the export stage. However, it is reasonable to assume that the duties and the costs associated with the staple system ultimately had an effect on the prices merchants were willing to pay for wool at the point of production. A higher tax burden on exports would likely depress the price offered to the grower, as merchants sought to maintain their own profit margins. Thus, these seemingly remote administrative regulations in London and the port towns would have had ripples, however faint, back to the sheep-dotted hills and valleys across England. The entire economic chain, from the shepherd to the Flemish weaver, was now more firmly, if sometimes unwillingly, linked to the fiscal needs and administrative reach of the English crown. This increasing regulation was a defining feature of the late 13th and early 14th centuries, a slow tightening of the governmental grip on the nation's primary export. The second half of the 14th century, particularly after the capture of Calais by Edward III in 1347, saw the English wool trade regulations reach a new level of systematic control and, indeed, a peak in the rates of taxation. The establishment of Calais as the primary and often compulsory staple for English wool exports from 1363 onwards became a cornerstone of English commercial and fiscal policy for a very long period. This era also witnessed the wool subsidy becoming a regular and extremely heavy parliamentary tax, often far exceeding the original ancient custom. The decision to make Calais the staple was driven by several factors. Its strategic location, directly across the Channel, made it easily accessible from English ports and a convenient distribution point for buyers from Flanders, Brabant, and beyond. Crucially, as an English possession, it allowed the Crown to exert direct control over the trade conducted there. English officials, under a captain of Calais and a mayor of the staple, could oversee all transactions, ensure the collection of all duties, and enforce quality standards. The revenues generated at Calais, both from the wool duties and from local taxes within the town, became a vital source of funding for maintaining the English garrison there and for the broader war effort against France. The Company of the Staple, an organization of English merchants granted a monopoly on wool exports to Calais, also became a powerful institution, closely intertwined with royal finance, often advancing loans to the Crown against future customs revenues. The taxation on wool during this period became exceptionally burdensome. While the ancient custom of 6 shillings and 8 pence per sack technically remained, it was dwarfed by the parliamentary subsidies on wool. These subsidies were granted by Parliament, usually for a limited number of years, but were frequently renewed and often at very high rates. It was not uncommon for the subsidy to be 40 shillings per sack, or even higher, meaning that the total tax on a sack of wool could be almost 7 times the original ancient custom. This made English wool exceedingly expensive for continental buyers, but it also generated enormous revenues for the Crown, forming at times the largest single component of royal income. The justification for these heavy taxes was invariably the ongoing 100 Years' War with France. Parliament, while sometimes grumbling about the rates, generally acquiesced, recognizing the king's need for funds to defend the realm and pursue his dynastic claims in France. The administration of the Calais staple was elaborate. All wool destined for lawful export from England, except for some limited licenses to export elsewhere, particularly to Italy by sea, had to be shipped to Calais. Upon arrival, the wool was unloaded, inspected, and weighed by staple officials. It was then offered for sale in the Calais wool market, where merchants from the Low Countries, France, Germany, and Italy would make their purchases. The Company of the Staple Merchants acted as the intermediaries. Strict rules governed the conduct of trade within the staple, credit terms, quality standards, dispute resolution, all were subject to detailed ordinances. The payment for the wool was often made in bullion or foreign coin, which was then meant to be repatriated to England, helping the English balance of payments and supplying the royal mint. However, ensuring this repatriation was a constant administrative challenge. The collection of the duties at Calais also became highly organized. While some duties were still collected in English ports before export, a significant portion, particularly the heavy subsidies, was often levied at Calais itself, either from the English stapler merchant upon selling his wool, or directly from the foreign buyer. This system had the advantage of collecting the tax at the point where the wool was actually sold and its value realized. The officials of the Calais staple, treasurers, controllers, weighers, searchers, formed a complex bureaucracy, their salaries and expenses paid out of the revenues they collected. Their records, when they survive, provide a detailed picture of the trade flow, the merchants involved, and the sums of money changing hands. Despite the apparent efficiency of the Calais staple, problems persisted. Smuggling of wool out of England to avoid the staple, and the heavy duties remained a significant issue. The long coastline, particularly in areas like Kent and Sussex facing directly towards Flanders, offered many opportunities for illicit export. Royal officials, including specially appointed searchers, patrolled the coasts and ports, attempting to intercept smugglers, but their task was immense. The penalties for smuggling were severe, often involving confiscation of the ship and goods, and imprisonment or heavy fines for the perpetrators. Yet, the potential profits from evading duties that could amount to 50% or more of the wool's legitimate export price ensured that the practice continued. Furthermore, the high price of English wool, inflated by the heavy taxation, began to have long-term consequences. While English wool was still prized for its quality, cloth producers in the Low Countries and elsewhere started to seek alternative, cheaper sources of wool, notably from Spain. The Spanish merino wool, though different in character, began to offer a viable alternative, particularly for lower and medium-grade textiles. This gradually eroded England's near-monopoly position for the finest wools. Simultaneously, within England itself, the high export duties on raw wool, compared to much lower duties on exported finished cloth, began to encourage the growth of the domestic English cloth industry. It became more profitable for English entrepreneurs to make wool into cloth within England and export the finished product rather than exporting the raw material. This was a slow, long-term shift, but the heavy taxation of raw wool exports in the late 14th century undoubtedly contributed to this trend, which would have profound implications for the English economy in the centuries to come. The administration of the regulations also involved constant negotiation and interaction between the Crown, Parliament, and the merchant community, particularly the powerful company of the staple. The staplers, while benefiting from their monopoly, also bore the brunt of collecting and often prepaying the heavy duties. They frequently petitioned the Crown for redress of grievances, for better enforcement against smuggling, or for adjustments to the staple ordinances. Parliament, too, often voiced concerns about the impact of the high wool taxes on the broader economy, even as it continued to grant them. The Good Parliament of 1376, for instance, famously impeached several royal ministers and financiers accused of corruption and mismanagement, some of which related to the wool trade and its revenues. This demonstrates the high political stakes involved in the administration of this vital national resource. The system was not static. It was subject to continuous pressures, adjustments, and the quiet, ongoing struggles of various interest groups, all recorded in the dry, formal language of petitions, statutes, and exchequer accounts. Thus, by the close of the 14th century, the English wool trade was a highly regulated and heavily taxed sector. The journey of a sack of wool from a sheep's back in the English countryside to a loom in Flanders was now punctuated by numerous administrative hurdles, official inspections, and significant fiscal levies, primarily centered around the Calais staple. This complex edifice of control, built up piece by painstaking piece over 2 centuries, reflected the growing power and ambition of the medieval English state and its insatiable need for revenue, particularly to fund its protracted wars. The story is one of bureaucratic evolution, of the slow spread of officialdom into the realm of commerce, a testament to the enduring power of government to regulate and to tax, even in the seemingly distant medieval past. As we transition from the close of the 14th century into the complexities of the 15th, the great era of English raw wool export, while still significant, begins a slow, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable process of waning. The Calais staple, though still the mandated choke point for much of the legitimate trade, faced evolving economic realities and persistent administrative challenges. The heavy taxation, so characteristic of the 100 Years' War period, continued in various forms, and the very structure of the English textile economy was gradually, laboriously shifting. This part of our saga will examine these subtle transformations and the unyielding, if sometimes creaking, administrative machinery that attempted to manage them from approximately the year 1400 to the accession of the Tudor dynasty around 1485. One of the primary factors contributing to this gradual shift was the continued and indeed accelerating growth of the English domestic cloth industry. As we have previously, though briefly, alluded, the fiscal policies of successive English monarchs, which imposed significantly higher export duties on raw wool compared to finished cloth, created a powerful economic incentive. It became increasingly profitable for English entrepreneurs, clothiers as they were known, to purchase English wool domestically, employ weavers, fullers, dyers, and other artisans within England to transform it into various grades of textile, and then export the finished cloth. This cloth, subject to lower export taxes, could be more competitively priced in continental markets. Towns in East Anglia, the West Country, and Yorkshire became notable centers of this burgeoning cloth production, their looms consuming ever more of the domestic wool clip that might previously have been destined for Calais. This development, while economically beneficial for England in the long run, presented challenges for the traditional wool staplers and the administration of the Calais staple. The volume of raw wool passing through Calais began to plateau and then, in certain decades, to decline, This, in turn, affected the revenues collected there and the financial viability of the staple organization itself. The Company of the Staple, still a powerful lobby, fought to protect its members' interests, sometimes petitioning the Crown for stricter enforcement against domestic clothiers who were, in their view, diverting wool from the staple, or for adjustments in the relative rates of taxation on wool versus cloth. These were slow, bureaucratic struggles played out in Parliament and through endless written supplications to the King's Council, each document penned with careful, formal language. The administration of the Calais staple itself, though well established, was not immune to the problems of the age. The costs of maintaining the garrison and fortifications of Calais remained substantial, particularly as the 100 Years' War sputtered through its later, more sporadic phases, and then as relations with the Dukes of Burgundy, who controlled Flanders, fluctuated. The salaries of the numerous staple officials, from the mayor and treasurer down to the most junior clerk or way-beam attendant, had to be met. If the volume of wool, and thus the revenue from duties, declined, it put pressure on the staple's finances. There are records of staple officials complaining of arrears in their pay, or of the difficulty in funding necessary repairs to the wool houses or the town walls. Furthermore, the very process of channeling all wool through Calais, while intended for control, could also lead to inefficiencies and vulnerabilities if, for example, political relations with Burgundy soured, access for Flemish and Brabantine merchants to Calais could be restricted, leading to a glut of unsold wool within the staple and financial hardship for the English staplers. Piracy in the Channel, though perhaps less intense than in earlier periods, remained a threat to the ships carrying wool to Calais and coin or goods back to England. Each voyage required careful consideration of convoy arrangements or the payment of insurance, adding further to the costs managed by the merchant. The Crown's reliance on the wool duties, though perhaps slightly lessened by the rise of cloth exports, remained significant. Successive Lancastrian and Yorkist kings, often facing internal political instability during the Wars of the Roses, or needing funds for their own households and limited foreign ventures, continued to look to the wool trade as a source of income. Parliamentary grants of wool subsidies continued, though perhaps with more debate and for shorter periods than in the height of the 100 Years' War. The machinery of collection in English ports, the customers, controllers, searchers, remained in place, diligently, if unexcitingly, going about their tasks of inspecting, weighing, sealing with the coquet, and recording. The parchment rolls of their particulars of account continued to accumulate in the exchequer, detailing each sack of wool, each last of hides, each merchant, each ship. The issue of smuggling, that persistent shadow of any highly regulated trade, certainly did not disappear in the 15th century. Indeed, as the legitimate trade through Calais perhaps became more burdensome or less profitable for some, the incentive to find alternative illicit routes may even have increased for certain individuals. The searchers along the English coasts still had their work cut out for them, their task unchanged: to identify undeclared wool, to seize uncustomed goods, and to bring offenders before the exchequer or the King's Bench. The records of these courts continued to feature cases related to the owling trade, a testament to the ongoing quiet battle between the state's desire for fiscal control and the merchant's desire for untaxed profit. Consider the life of a customs collector in a port like Ipswich or Sandwich in the mid-15th century. His duties would have been largely unchanged from those of his predecessors 50 or 100 years earlier. He would rise, attend his office at the custom house near the quay, receive declarations from merchants or shipmasters, oversee the weighing of wool at the town's tron, calculate the ancient custom and any current parliamentary subsidy, receive the payment or an instrument of surety, ensure the coquet seal was properly applied, and meticulously enter the details into his roll using the formalized Latin and Norman French phrases of exchequer accounting. His controller colleague would keep a parallel record. At intervals, these rolls would be sent to London for audit. It was a life of routine, of careful adherence to established procedure, far removed from the dynastic struggles that might be convulsing the kingdom at large, yet essential to the funding of those very struggles. The quiet scratching of quills on parchment in these provincial custom houses was an unsung but vital part of medieval English governance. The quality of wool and attempts to regulate it also continued to be a concern, albeit one often addressed through guild regulations or staple ordinances rather than direct royal statute at this point. False packing of fleeces, placing inferior wool, dirt, or even stones in the center of a sack with better quality wool on the outside, was a perennial problem that could damage the reputation of English wool in general. The officials at Calais and the company of the staple itself had an interest in preventing such deceits, as it affected the price they could command. Thus, further layers of inspection and regulation specific to the staple would be applied, adding to the administrative burden on the merchant before his wool could finally be sold. Each step, each official, each piece of parchment represented a small but cumulative element in the complex and highly regulated system that the English wool trade had become. As the 15th century draws to its close, and the Tudor dynasty under Henry VII ascends to the English throne around 1485, the great edifice of medieval wool trade regulation, centered on the Calais staple, remains largely intact, yet it is a system undeniably in its late autumn. The fundamental structures, the ancient custom, the parliamentary subsidies, though perhaps granted with different justifications, the roles of collectors, controllers, searchers, and the staple officials in Calais persisted with a kind of bureaucratic inertia. However, the economic landscape around this administrative structure had continued its slow, inexorable shift, and the seeds of future, more profound changes were quietly being sown. Our final, very brief examination will touch upon this period of continuity in administration set against a backdrop of evolving commercial realities into the very early years of the 16th century. The primary concern for Henry VII, in common with his medieval predecessors, was financial stability and the augmentation of royal revenue. He was renowned for his fiscal prudence and his diligence in exploiting all traditional sources of income. The customs duties on wool and wool fells, therefore, continued to be meticulously collected, The administrative machinery inherited from the Yorkist and Lancastrian kings was maintained and, where possible, perhaps even tightened. Instructions to customs officials would continue to flow from the exchequer, emphasizing the need for accurate assessment and diligent collection. Audits of customs accounts would proceed with their usual deliberate pace. The port books, as these detailed local customs records were increasingly known, continued to be filled with the names of merchants, the quantities of wool, and the duties paid, each entry a testament to the enduring nature of this fiscal system. The Calais staple, though the volume of wool passing through it was likely much diminished from its 14th century peak, still functioned as the legally mandated entrepot for most raw wool exports. The company of the staple, though perhaps less politically influential than in its heyday, when it bankrolled kings, still guarded its remaining privileges and fulfilled its role as the primary conduit for this trade. The officials in Calais, the mayor, the treasurer, the weighers, would continue their daily routines, overseeing the landing, storage, sale, and taxation of English wool. The detailed regulations governing conduct within the staple, refined over generations, would still be enforced. The need to fund the Calais garrison, a strategic English outpost on continental soil, ensured that the Crown had a vested interest in maintaining the staple's viability, even if the overall economic significance of raw wool exports was being gradually eclipsed by the trade in finished English cloth. This rise of the English cloth trade was, by now, an undeniable economic reality. England was transforming from primarily an exporter of raw materials, wool, to an exporter of manufactured goods, textiles. This shift had profound implications. While the export of cloth also generated customs revenue, the rates were different, and the trade was often conducted through different channels and by different groups of merchants, such as the merchant adventurers, who focused on cloth exports to northern Europe. This created a new set of administrative challenges and opportunities for the Crown, but our focus here remains on the lingering administration of the raw wool trade. The point is that the context in which the old wool regulations operated was changing, making the traditional system seem, perhaps, increasingly anachronistic, even if it remained stubbornly in place. The search for illicit wool exports, the perennial problem of owling, would also have continued. With a shrinking legitimate market through Calais for some producers, or with the temptation of avoiding the still significant duties, the incentives for smuggling remained. The royal searchers along the coasts, therefore, would not have found their occupations redundant. Their quiet vigilance, their inspection of suspicious vessels, their pursuit of information regarding clandestine shipments, these tasks would persist, a familiar if uncelebrated feature of coastal administration. The legal records would still, from time to time, document seizures and prosecutions related to the illegal export of wool, a quiet echo of a much larger historical trade. Consider the sheer weight of accumulated administrative precedent. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the customs system for wool had been operating, with various modifications, for over 200 years. Generations of officials had been trained in its procedures. Mountains of parchment records had been created and archived. This institutional memory and the established routines created a powerful momentum for continuity. To dismantle or radically reform such a deeply entrenched system would have been a formidable undertaking, requiring significant political will and a clear vision for an alternative, something not immediately apparent in this period of transition. Thus, the old forms, the old offices, the old methods of accounting largely persisted, even as the trade itself was slowly changing its fundamental character. The language of the customs accounts, the formulae used in the coquet certificates, the very design of the coquet seals, these elements would have exhibited a remarkable continuity, connecting the officials of Henry VII's reign directly back to their predecessors under the Edwards and Richards of centuries past. It is a reminder that administrative systems, once established, can often outlive the specific economic conditions they were initially designed to address, adapting slowly, if at all, to new realities until a more decisive break with the past occurs. For the English wool trade at the dawn of the 16th century, that decisive break was yet to come, but the ground was being prepared. The autumn of this particular regulatory system was ceding almost imperceptibly to the early frost of winter. We now venture, with our customary lack of haste, into the early and middle decades of the 16th century. The Tudor monarchs, Henry VIII and his immediate successors, Edward VI and Mary I, presided over a period of immense religious and political upheaval in England. Yet, amidst these dramatic transformations, the Reformation, the dissolution of the monasteries, shifts in foreign alliances, the ancient administrative structures governing the raw wool export trade, particularly through the Calais staple, displayed a remarkable, if somewhat hollowed-out, persistence. This section of our unending saga will explore the enduring forms of this system, even as its economic substance continued its inexorable decline, a bureaucracy operating almost by muscle memory as the world around it irrevocably changed. The Calais staple, that venerable institution, England's toehold on the continent, and the mandated funnel for its wool, remained in English hands until its rather abrupt loss in 1558. Throughout the first half of the 16th century, therefore, it continued to function, at least nominally, as the primary destination for legally exported English raw wool. The Company of the Staple, though its membership was likely smaller and its overall wealth diminished compared to its zenith, still existed. Its officials, the mayor, the constable, the treasurer of the staple, would still be elected or appointed, and they would still oversee the diminished trickle of wool that arrived at the Calais quays. The established routines of weighing, inspection, storage in the wool houses, and sale to continental merchants, primarily those from the Low Countries, would continue, governed by the ancient ordinances of the staple. However, the sheer volume of wool passing through Calais was a pale shadow of what it had been in the 14th or even early 15th centuries. The English cloth industry, now a dominant force in the national economy, consumed the vast majority of England's wool production. The great flocks still grazed upon the downs and in the pastures, but their fleeces were increasingly destined for looms in Norwich, Exeter, or the West Riding of Yorkshire, rather than for the ships sailing to Calais. This meant that the customs revenues generated at Calais from raw wool, once a cornerstone of royal finance, were now a far less significant component of the Crown's income. Other sources, such as the duties on exported cloth and new forms of taxation like subsidies on land and goods, were becoming more important. Despite this diminished economic role, the administrative apparatus remained largely in place, a testament to the inertia of established governmental structures. The collectors and controllers of customs in English ports like London, Boston, Hull, and Southampton would still be appointed. They would still be responsible for levying the ancient custom and any parliamentary subsidies on the small quantities of raw wool presented for export. The coquet seals, bearing the insignia of the reigning Tudor monarch, would still be meticulously applied to the certified sacks and the coquet letters issued. The parchment rolls of their accounts, the port books, would continue to be compiled, their Latin and archaic French entries detailing transactions that were becoming increasingly infrequent compared to the bustling trade in cloth. Imagine the scene at a smaller English port, perhaps one that had once seen a steady stream of wool ships bound for Calais. Now, weeks or even months might pass between such consignments. Yet, the royal customs officer, if one was still permanently stationed there, or if the duty fell to a local official like the mayor, would still be expected to follow the prescribed procedures when a wool merchant eventually appeared. The tron, or official waybeam, would still need to be maintained, its accuracy periodically checked. The schedule of fees and duties, perhaps centuries old in its basic structure, would still be consulted. The entire process, once vital and dynamic, now carried an air of preserved ritual, a set of administrative motions performed because the regulations, never formally repealed, still demanded them. The challenges of maintaining Calais itself also contributed to the picture. The fortifications required constant upkeep, and the garrison needed to be paid. With the declining revenues from the wool trade at Calais, these costs became an increasing burden on the English exchequer. Successive Tudor governments grappled with the expense, sometimes seeking contributions from the Company of the Staple, sometimes diverting other royal funds. The strategic importance of Calais was still recognized, particularly as a base for asserting English influence on the continent or for launching military expeditions. But its role as a thriving commercial hub for wool was undeniably fading. The issue of smuggling, that age-old companion to regulated trade, likely adapted to these changing circumstances. With less legitimate raw wool being exported, any illicit trade in wool might have become even more difficult to distinguish from the extensive coastal trade in other goods or from the legitimate export of cloth. However, as long as any duties remained on raw wool, and as long as the Calais staple was the mandated point of export, there would have been some incentive, however small, for those wishing to evade these controls entirely. The searches on the English coasts, therefore, would have retained a purpose even if the scale of their expected discoveries had diminished. Their vigilance was a reminder that the old laws, however economically outmoded some might seem, were still technically in force. The language and formulae of the customs documents themselves would have provided a powerful link to the past. A customs officer in the reign of Henry VIII, when filling out a coquet letter, might be using phrases and a style of script that would have been perfectly familiar to an official doing the same job under Richard II. This continuity of administrative practice, of bureaucratic language, is a fascinating aspect of historical governance. It demonstrates how systems can persist, how the written word and established procedure can create a framework that endures across generations, even as the underlying economic realities transform. The very parchment, the ink, the seals, these physical artifacts of administration carried the weight of centuries of usage. The dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII in the 1530s also had an indirect impact. While monastic estates had long since shifted from being primary direct exporters to selling their wool on the domestic market, they were still significant producers. Their dissolution and the transfer of their vast lands to the crown and then to lay owners changed patterns of landholding and agricultural production, but the wool itself still flowed into the domestic cloth industry rather than significantly reviving the export trade in raw fleeces through Calais. The fundamental economic shift towards domestic cloth production was too powerful to be reversed by such changes in land tenure alone. The Calais staple system was designed for a different economic era. We arrive now, at the very end of our meticulously unhurried journey, to consider the final echoes of the medieval English raw wool export administration, primarily as it manifested through the Calais staple and the enduring legacy of its bureaucratic practices. The loss of Calais to the French in January of 1558, during the reign of Mary I, effectively and rather abruptly brought an end to the physical existence of the staple as it had been known for over 2 centuries. This event serves as a convenient, if somewhat arbitrary, marker for the conclusion of a distinct administrative epoch, though the underlying economic trends had long foreshadowed this obsolescence. The fall of Calais, while a blow to English prestige and a strategic loss, was perhaps less of an immediate economic catastrophe for the wool trade than it might have been a century or 2 earlier. By 1558, the vast majority of English wool was, as we have repeatedly and perhaps tediously emphasized, being consumed by the domestic cloth industry. The export of finished cloth had become the dominant feature of England's overseas trade. Therefore, the closure of the Calais staple as the mandated outlet for raw wool did not cripple the English economy in the way its temporary disruption might have done in the 14th century. It was, rather, the removal of an increasingly anachronistic and financially burdensome administrative appendage. However, the legacy of the centuries of wool trade regulation was profound and multifaceted. Firstly, the very concept of a centrally controlled and systematically administered customs service in England owed much to its origins in the wool trade. The structures developed from the late 13th century onwards: the appointment of collectors, controllers, searchers, the use of coquet seals and certificates, the system of port books and exchequer audits, provided the foundational grammar for English customs administration for centuries to come, adapted and applied to new commodities and evolving trade patterns. The procedures honed in the wool custom houses of Boston, London, and Hull, and at the Staple in Calais, were not simply abandoned, they were the bedrock upon which future customs systems were built. Secondly, the long history of wool taxation had firmly established the principle of parliamentary consent for significant regular taxation on trade. While medieval kings had often asserted prerogative rights to levy duties, the recurrent need to secure parliamentary grants for the heavy wool subsidies, particularly during the 100 Years' War, had reinforced the role of Parliament in fiscal matters. This was a crucial, if slowly developed, element in the evolving constitutional balance of the English kingdom. The debates over wool taxes in medieval parliaments were part of this larger narrative of political development. Thirdly, the intense regulation and taxation of the wool trade had, as we've noted, inadvertently spurred the growth of the English cloth industry. By making raw wool exports expensive, it created a competitive advantage for cloth manufactured within England. This long-term structural shift in the English economy, from a supplier of raw materials to a producer of manufactured goods, was one of the most significant outcomes of the medieval period, and the wool trade regulations played an undeniable, if complex, role in that transformation. The administrative oversight, therefore, had unforeseen but deeply impactful economic consequences. Even after the loss of Calais, some vestigial elements of the old system persisted for a time. The export of raw wool did not entirely cease overnight, though it was minimal. Small quantities might still be licensed for export, and duties, based on the old schedules, might still be collected. But the grand, elaborate machinery of the Calais staple was gone. The company of the staple, deprived of its primary raison d'être, faded into historical obscurity, though it technically continued to exist in some form for a very long time, a curious relic of a bygone commercial era. The very language of customs administration, the archaic terms found in the port books, the formal procedures of the exchequer, many of these had their roots in the medieval wool trade. The quiet diligence of generations of customs officials, their meticulous record-keeping, their adherence to established protocols, all contributed to a culture of bureaucracy that, while often perceived as slow or cumbersome, was also essential for the functioning of the state. The skills developed in managing the complex accounts of the wool duties were transferable to other areas of royal finance and administration. And so, the great wool sacks, once England's golden fleece, the source of royal wealth and the subject of intense administrative scrutiny for centuries, finally receded from the center stage of English export trade. Their story, in terms of large-scale, centrally regulated export, had run its course. What remained were the echoes, the established customs procedures, the precedent of parliamentary taxation on trade, a transformed domestic textile industry, and the countless carefully inscribed parchment records stored within the royal archives, a silent, dusty testament to a vast and intricate system of medieval governance. Our extended and intentionally unhurried chronicle of the development and administration of these regulations now reaches its final soft conclusion. From the early unregulated flows of the 13th century through the meticulous and burdensome controls of the Calais staple at its height, to its eventual quiet fading in the shadow of a dominant cloth industry, we have attempted to trace the mundane yet profoundly significant path of this administrative history. May this final recounting of fading forms and the quiet cessation of centuries-old practices have provided the ultimate gentle descent into the deepest and most undisturbed slumber,